colonization that took place when Britain came involved with the slave trade around about the 1600s. They started to identify by way of trade, and then later on for the exploitation of African people in the Caribbean islands. And obviously we know that many of the people from this country, you know, migrated to places like the Caribbean and to North America as well. So there's been a long relationship with black people. Okay, so there are some of the main focuses which I'm going to look at today. Imperialism, this will be integrated into my talk. Colonization, colonialism, racial discrimination, integration. I think the best point for us to start is looking at what took place in 1492. Because as we know, at that particular time, this was the last walk in the sun for African people. They controlled Spain for 800 years. They brought civilization to Europe. One of the things that the Moors did, they had introduced approximately 17 universities into Europe at that particular time, and they were the highest educational institutions at that particular time. In the city of Cordoba alone, in the 10th century, what you actually find, it was over 10,000 public schools, not private schools, public schools, and it was complete social equality between the sexes, male as well as females. We have evidence that goes back even 1,000 years of women becoming professors and creating university complexes within Andalusia or Islamic Spain and most of North Africa. So what you actually find at this particular time, this is where science, this is when the Moors had introduced science to Europe. Europeans only started to know about philosophy because of what the Moors had translated from Greek into Arabic, and then later on, with Jewish intermediaries, they translated some of this work later on into Latin, and then later on it came into the Italian languages, English language, the French, etc. That's how that came about. So this is a pivotal point in history, because this is where the slave trade would start. Africans have lost power in the North Atlantic at this particular time. The Europeans have now discovered most of what's taking place in the Caribbean islands and America. They're exploring particular places, and they can see how they can exploit the land at this particular point, because trade was an important factor for the survival of any culture or nation. If you look there, if you look at the Treaty of Tordesillas, now this was in 1493, 1494. And what I'm trying to emphasize here, this is when Spain and Portugal were fighting amongst each other. Now, when the Pope decided to split the world into two, he gave half the world to Portugal and the other half to Spain. Now, because of Columbus, Columbus had been working with the Portuguese for many decades. So what happened when he was working for the Portuguese, when he went back to the Pope and to the Spanish kingdoms, he actually got the equatorial lines moved slightly. This is why Brazil is Portuguese speaking today. Okay, so Brazil's Portuguese speaking because they were given, the Portuguese were given Brazil, Africa, and Asia. All the other parts beyond this equatorial line here was given to Spain. This is why this particular part, the Caribbean islands, Central America, South America, they speak Spanish. France, Britain, Holland, they were really upset with this treaty. Okay, and what happened around about the 1600s, the early 1600s, Holland and Britain allied themselves together to take away the colonies from the Spanish and the Portuguese. Now, a lot of people say that the Spanish were going back into Africa, but Spain could not go into Africa after 1493 because that was Portuguese territory. Okay, so you'll find a lot of history books will say, well, the Spanish went into Africa, they couldn't, they didn't have permission. Round about 1517, they started offering what was known as the Asiento de Negros. And what the Asiento basically was, it was licenses given to other European nations in order to take slaves from West Africa to the rest of the world. In this world, the New World, which is the Caribbean islands, Central America. Okay, so that was the first commissioning of slaves by Charles V of Spain. Okay, between 4,000 and 15,000, there was a massive amount of land that they were trying to exploit, okay, in that particular region at that time. When we talk about the New World, we're not just talking about the Caribbean islands, we're talking about North America and Central America as well. At this particular time, the Songhai Empire, if most of you have heard about the University of Timbuktu, okay, this is when the power started to dwindle. Now, security was lost. There was internal wars that was taking place in West Africa at this particular time. They weren't just fighting their cousins up in the north. They were also fighting incursions that was coming in of other Europeans. And this is how security basically fell, and this is how Europeans were able to exploit, the labor force, which was actually in Africa. And they were taking young people out. Let's have a look at the Empire and Britain. If you could look at the British Empire was huge. And if you look at Britain there, a small island, how were they able to conquer this amount of the world in such a short space of time? And I can think, as a historian myself, I find it was absolutely amazing as a historian to know how the British were able to pull themselves out from where they were within about 100 to 150 years in order to control trade, to control the Atlantic, and to develop on a mass scale the Americas. Where does it begin? Now, at the time with the Treaty of Tordesillas, etc., what happened during the Elizabethan period, they were really upset about this particular treaty. And there was this element of proselytization where many of the religious figures at that particular time, they were basically thinking of Christianizing the world. And that was their justification in some sense of trying to Christianize infidels. Now, there was a concept which came in 1580, known as the Principles of Effective Occupation. And what this basically was, because territories belonged to the Spanish and the Portuguese, what the English crown was basically saying that if they were able to go into that land and occupy that land, they can keep it for themselves. This is how Holland and Britain started to take away most of the Spanish territories, especially like North America. If you look at the southern parts, that was known as the French Quarter, Louisiana, Mississippi. And they ended up selling that around about 1803, 1804 because of the Haitian Revolution, because 2/3 of the French economy relied on the sugar plantations within Haiti. So you can see how sugar was a very important commodity. Molasses was another important commodity, but the main commodity which they needed was labor. That was the main commodity at that particular period. Okay, Sir John Hawkins, okay, and this is what another thing which you'll find if you look at Sir John Hawkins, Sir Henry Morgan. A lot of slave traders were given the name Sir, okay? They called themselves privateers, where they were given so much of their wealth to the crown at that particular time. And they were given an element of respectability, and certain lands within the Caribbean line, in the Americas, were being allocated to them. Then we start to see the rise of different companies. Round about 1606, we see the London Adventurers and we see the Plymouth Merchants. One is basically taking back a lot of poor people back to the Americas. Because of enclosures that took place in the 1500s, there was a lot of homeless people within England and Wales. So what they started doing, they started filtering all those poor people to the Americas. But the main place which was concentrated was in the Caribbean islands, because the Spanish had major control in other areas. It was easy for them to get into the Caribbean islands. And the Plymouth Company, they basically dealt with commodities, minerals, okay, human cargo. So they dealt mainly with trade, okay? The London Adventurers, or the London Company, mainly dealt with transporting British people to their so-called colonies, okay? So this is what these two companies were really dealing with. Around about 1603, the first major companies that was established was the Dutch East India Company and the Dutch West India Company. Okay, and they were major companies at that particular time, and they were much more powerful and richer than the English. As many of the Europeans went over there, majority of the Europeans, or the British people that went to the Americas, that went to the Caribbean islands, were the poor. Those which had element of upward mobility became the planters. They never planted anything. What they were like overseers of certain plantations by the British, because that land belonged to the crown. Then you had the merchants, then you had the men of profession. So what you started to see in slowly, that educated class or educated people now was going over to the Caribbean islands and to the Americas to occupy that land and to develop them. Because majority of the people that went from this country to the Americas were illiterate. Okay, there was a high illiteracy rate. Okay, we talked about the slave trade. Now, the reason why I show this particular image here is because this image is mainly propaganda. Because if you notice, if you read the records carefully, what you'll notice is the way in which Africans were actually packed into the Middle Passage. If you look at there, there's an element of freedom, they're not chained up, etc. This was a type of image that they were trying to show people to justify what they were doing in the so-called Americas. And if you look at the slave class society, there were three different classes. You had the colored people, okay, they were more of your mixed race. Then you had the free blacks, and then you had the vast majority with the slave population. Now, the slave population was divided into 3 or 4 different categories. Now, when you watch a lot of movies and films and they talk about slavery, the ones which they seem to focus on primarily is number 4, the field hands. But they were actually the minority. The vast majority of the slaves there that were in the Americas were the mechanics. They were skilled artisans, because they weren't taking thick people or stupid people from out of Africa. They were taking the youngest and the best. And these were people, because of the Songhai Empire, the Mali Empire, there was many different universities. What started happening was they were taking out educated people. These were literate people. Okay, so if you go back to the 1600s in Africa, in West Africa at this time, you're talking about a 99% literacy rate. That's so many people, and women actually, were educated. Women could read, women could write books, okay? And that basically started to crumble as a result of European occupation. So you had the mechanics, you got your domestic servants, the headmen, and then you had your field hands or your boiling hands. Your boiling hands were mainly concentrated in the Caribbean islands. So this is how black society in the so-called Americas was stratified. Let's look at black labor, okay? So I've given you a context and the foundation of history and how that connection came about. So as far as black labor is concerned, black labor within Britain and the British Empire is at least 300 to 400 years, okay? It didn't just take place after the Second World War, okay? That's how long it's actually been. Here, I got an image here looking at the West Indians and the West African troops arrive in Britain in 1915. These things you never hear about. These things they never really talk about in documentaries or when Black History Month come from. Okay, so it says there, a few blacks in Britain formed the permanent black community during the First World War. Several thousands were brought to Britain to do work that would free Britons for combat service. So what was taking place at the First World War at this particular time, the colonies were using their black labor force to come over here to replace the workers because they were putting a lot of the males into war because of what took place during that particular period. Now, not all black men which came to this country worked in the factories. A lot of them actually provided a service in the war. And you can see here, West Indian troops served on the western front of the Somme. When they talk about the Somme War and what took place in the Somme, you never see these images. There was a lot of black soldiers that actually died and fought in this country for the empire. There was an element of patriotism for blacks in order to fight for the mother country. And this same thing will be filtered out when we look at the Windrush period. They believed they were coming over here to do something for their mother country. Because what the planters and the merchants and the men of profession was teaching in the Caribbean islands was that your country loves you, your king loves you, your queen loves you, you're working for these people, okay? And if you work hard enough, etc., you will get your freedom. So they believed by offering their services to war, when they were fighting the Germans during the First World War, would give them some sort of freedom. But when they went back to their countries, or when many of them had settled here, unemployment was high, there was different types of riots, different types of hostilities that faced these West Indian soldiers, or former soldiers. And there, if you look at these images, now, what I want to try to emphasize here is that there was approximately 20,000 black people that lived in Britain before the coming of the Second World War. Now, when I usually ask people what happened to these 20,000, because people always like to concentrate on the Windrush, what took place in 1948, 1949, when Jamaicans came over and other people started to join them, from Barbados, St. Kitts, Trinidad, Grenada, etc. What happened? What do you think happened to those 20,000? Because they literally have seemed to have disappeared by the 1940s. Just a basic question. What do you think happened to them?
They get moved elsewhere.
Got moved elsewhere? Any other? Okay, no. Some did go back. Some did go back, but the vast majority ended up marrying local women and the children became mixed. That's what happened. Okay? So what I'm trying to emphasize here is the element of integration. Integration is an old historical experience. It's not something that took place in the 1950s, 60s. This goes back in time. If you go back to the Roman Empire, the Greek Empire, miscegenation, mixing of people from different colors coming together, producing children was a norm. There was hardly or no form of discrimination at all when these sort of matches, came together. It only seemed to have come about really around about the 1600s. And intensified immensely when a lot of those Africans were taken from the Caribbean onto the Americas in order to establish themselves in European countries. Okay? When the war ended, the black community in Britain, and we're talking about Wales, there was a large black community even in Wales itself, in places like Swansea, Merthyr Tydfil, and even Cardiff itself. Okay? And many historians are digging up this information. Okay, the black community in Britain was quite large, perhaps as numerous as 20,000. Okay, that was the estimate at that particular period of time. The Times estimated in 1919 that there were over 1,000 black men out of work. Now, what took place during this period, after the First World War was over, there happened to be a racial contention or hostility that took place. The first race riots that took place in 1919 actually was in Cardiff. There was a race riots also in Newport, and race riots was also in Barry or Caddixton. Now, the thing I want to emphasize about the race riots that took place at this particular time, a lot of it was to do with integration or black males with white females. Okay? And another issue that I want to emphasize as well is that many of the black officers, when they returned back home or returned back to Wales or to England, they were able to keep their revolvers. Okay? There was a massive demonstration, approximately 1,000 white people that attacked many dark-skinned people down in the docks in Butetown. And one of the things I'd like to emphasize about that was that it wasn't just black men fighting, it was many white women fighting as well, because they married local women, and many of the mixed progeny that came from this particular experience. Because when many of the men came back from war, they started to realize a lot of these black men were in their jobs. Okay? Many of the women that the black men married were former prostitutes. And a lot of the pimps that went off to war wanted them back. But because they were already married to these men, so there was a combination of different things that caused the problem and the contention that took place in Cardiff in 1919. And like I said, they were the three major race riots that took place. Okay? There were people which were killed because, like I said, many black officers, when they returned back from the First World War, were able to keep their revolvers. Okay? Let's have a look at race relations. Okay? But when we look at race relations, we're looking at things like integration, say, for instance. One of the things that African Caribbeans or West Indians or Black Caribbeans or whatever the case may be, what they like to focus on by the dominant culture is mainly assimilation. And what assimilation basically is where that particular group, the subgroup, the lesser group, the subordinate type, has to throw away their cultural elements, their language, their belief, their morals, their customs, their norms, and their values. Okay? And that's what integration means primarily in Britain. Okay? There has been a lot of people who've assimilated, basically, been able to keep their culture. So they've been able to adapt to two cultures, prevailing cultures, their own as well as the dominant culture. And you have other people who actually hate their own culture and embrace themselves into the dominant culture. And you've got those who are just on the periphery, they're neither here or there. But one thing I want to emphasize here is looking at the element of assimilation. Okay? Right. Here now, I'd like to emphasize where it says no blacks, no Irish, no dogs. I was quite surprised that even in Cardiff, some of the streets in Cardiff was advertising these different types of signs. Okay? And this was really from the 1940s, where a large amount of black people from the colonies came over here to rebuild the country. And history teaches us that many of them came over here to rebuild the country because many of the white males did not want to take those jobs. They saw those jobs to be lowly, yeah, it didn't pay much, etc. So that's what they come over here for. Now, when I've interviewed many of the blacks that came over here after the 1940s, their intention really was to come over here for the short space of time, work for maybe 5-7 years, go back and build themselves a nice little house, a mansion, a business back in their homeland. Okay? But what unfortunately happened for many of them, because of the low pay, many of them end up staying here and dying over here. Many of them end up staying here for about 40, 50, even 60 years. The other thing I want to emphasize about blackness. Now, when we talk about blackness, before the 1980s, blackness was ascribed to the other. Okay? So Turkish people were considered black, Asians were considered black. Yeah, any person in the Mediterranean, people who were Italian, people who were French, Portuguese, Maltese, etc. That's what classified people as being black, meaning the other. And it's only really in the 1980s where they became a more distinctive and specific identifier for different groups of people. Because of race relations, mixing of different people coming together, and people trying to construct their own identity. Because for at least since the 1940s to the 1980s, for that 40 to 50 year period, what we started finding was that the element of identity was actually shaped and directed and formulated by the dominant culture. And this is very clear. If you look at most African Caribbeans, if you look at the generation that came over here, they would call themselves West Indians. The ones over here, which were educated over here, for instance, like my generation, we wanted to identify ourselves with Africa. This is why we're called African Caribbeans. Sometimes if you go to an African Caribbean household, for instance, you'll have one group which will call themselves West Indians. The next generation, which is my generation, we call ourselves African Caribbeans. And the next generation will probably call themselves black. Okay? Now, many of them, the younger generation again, will call themselves urban, whatever that's supposed to mean. Okay? That's an identity. Urban is an identity now. But what I want to show you is the different shifts that has taken place as far as identity was concerned. Because they were colonized, yeah, their identity was shaped by the other. Okay? And if you go back from 1492 right up until the 21st century, black people in Britain have gone through approximately 11 to 12 different identities. And every one of those forms of identity was constructed by somebody else, okay, as opposed to being constructed by themselves. So the thing is, what I want to emphasize here, that sometimes when immigrant groups come to a particular place or come to a particular country, yeah, and try to follow the mores of that particular land, it can become contentious and problematic at times when they are not able to construct or to identify themselves to what they want to be. And it's imposed, the imposition is coming from somebody else. Then we have our friend Enoch Powell. Now, what a lot of people didn't know about Enoch Powell, that he was the one which was instrumental in asking many of the colonies, the people from the colonies, to come over here to work, especially in the health services. Okay? He was a minister for the Conservative Party. He was identified with health, and he was the one which was actually promoting this, formulating this. But because of the amount of black people that were coming from the Caribbean islands, he felt, and there was a lot of contention and hostilities within many of the communities, he wanted to see the deportation of them. And many of us know about this speech, the rivers of blood, and what sort of things would take place within the future if more and more black migration would take place in this country, and what type of problems it would actually cause. Okay, so we talk about the Windrush now. Okay, ethnocentrism is another term. This is something which is classical with the dominant culture, for many people in dominant culture, unfortunately, where they will try to shape their experiences onto someone else, okay? So unfortunately, what has taken place as a result of colonization, colonialism, and all these other type of things is that the other, the native from the other country, is unable to formulate their own understanding and formulate their own experiences. It's basically where a dominant culture will use their own cultural lens to view a particular person. And this is common in most of the colonial materials or narratives that you read. As an example, if you go back to many of the narratives you find in the Caribbean islands where merchants and men of the profession were talking about their so-called slaves, they would say that these people were happy being slaves because in the evenings they would dance and they would play music, they would dance and they would be happy. And that used as an identifier to say they were happy in their condition, as opposed to seeing that they had to make good do from a poor or a bad situation. Okay? And the other thing I want to emphasize here is what is ethnicity? Unfortunately, I give a lot of presentations and talks about ethnicity, and what I find quite striking as a historian, as a social scientist, is that we still find in the 21st century where people from the dominant culture will not see themselves as being an ethnic group. An ethnic group is people who have a shared identity. They have a shared experience. Okay? So, for instance, the Welsh are an ethnic group. They are not the same as the English. They have their customs, norms, values, language, etc. Okay? The English is different from the Irish. Okay? So within the nativeness of this land, you've got 4 distinctive ethnic groups from the dominant culture. But if you were to speak to people who are educated to an extent and ask them about ethnicity, they always feel it's the other. It's the Arab, it's the Asian, it's the black. It can't be us. Okay? So this type of dichotomy still exists and permeates through our thinking, through society, and sometimes through the advertisements as well. I remember a few years ago in supermarkets where they had a section which is known as ethnic section. And but it was quite funny because the whole supermarket should be called the ethnic section because majority of the food that is sold in the supermarket is imported into this country from somewhere else. So having just an ethnic section and trying to be more specific on that is not realistic at all. Okay? But I think people are becoming, because of integration, because of miscegenation, people mixing together, coming together, people trying to understand and share their values, share their understanding. Things are becoming more to head where people are beginning to accept difference. Okay? Because the aspect of superiority, inferiority is weeding away. It is going away slowly, but it still permeates and exists to a large extent, even till today. Just a few things when we talk about prejudice, discrimination. All Porto was a psychologist, and I want to connect this even to the labor markets within this country, because what a lot of people don't know and realize was that when a lot of the black workers came to this country to work, many of them were not allowed to join unions. Okay, many of them weren't allowed to join unions. However, when many of the white workers felt that their livelihood was under threat or their businesses may go abroad, etc., they would then ask many of those West Indian males and females to join the unions in order to bolster their support, their existence, their stability. Okay? So as far as integration in the workplace came, it didn't come for many, many decades. We only started to see elements of integration within the workplace really from the 1960s. A lot of focus, when I look at America for this, we look at racial segregation in America. There was actually racial segregation over here. You know, black people, say for instance, they couldn't go into restaurants, hotels, dance halls. Okay? And I do know that the British government in the 1970s, late 70s and 80s, actually banned black people in this country from going to nightclubs because of the type of hostilities that was taking place. So what you started to see emerge from that experience was all the house parties where West Indians used to call them blues. Blues just basically meant sorrow, sadness. And then policemen stopping and saying you need to turn your music down. So they were literally isolated to their own homes. As far as housing was concerned, they could come over here to build houses, but they couldn't live in them. Okay? A lot of the West Indians that worked in the health service couldn't use that service. They can give service to other people, but they themselves, when they got ill, they couldn't use that service themselves. So this is why I feel this is really important for us really and truly when we're looking at the elements of